Many of you have been asking this question: should you choose the 14-inch MacBook Pro M2, the stock configuration, or get a MacBook Air M2 and upgrade it to 24 gigabytes of memory? So I'm going to take this two machine through a test in a pro workflow for photography and really figure out which one is the better buy. Let's find out. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. If you have been following the channel, thank you. If you're new, welcome. Please consider subscribing because that will definitely help me out. I'll be sharing a lot of information, and I highly encourage that you pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. As usual, there'll be timestamp in the description below. You can jump ahead. However, if you're new, I recommend that you sit through the introduction to get an idea as to the methodology for my testing. I'll also leave additional video links in the description below as well on how to profile and how to use reference mode on your XDR display, and also the other M2 tests that I've run are all going to be below too. If you find the information I'm sharing with you helpful, please consider help supporting the channel either through the tip jar or YouTube Super Thanks. I would greatly appreciate that. All the funding that comes in would help directly support this channel and also goes into a saving fund for me to purchase future machine to run testing. And with this in mind, let's take a look at our test machines. So predominantly, we'll be looking at two of them: the base 14-inch MacBook Pro and the MacBook Air that has been upgraded to the brim in almost every single aspect. The M2 SoC is an upgrade, memory, and also SSD. This is bringing as close as possible this M2 MacBook Air machine to the base 14-inch MacBook Pro M2. And once we have done all of this, the pricing variation comes down to $100. So we're going to find out if spending that extra $100 to go to the Pro is worth it. I can tell you right now that it's probably going to be a much better deal, because a few things I also want to point out right away is that on the MacBook Pro, you have an active cooling on the system, meaning that there is a fan. So when the SoC or the system runs hot, the fan can just kick in and really cool the machine down. This way you can run tasks at a much longer duration without any slowdown or thermal throttling. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you get a much better display. You get an XDR display inside the 14-inch MacBook Pro, whereas you just get the regular display inside the MacBook Air. So that's another thing to think about. You also get more ports on the system. You have one additional Thunderbolt port, a full HDMI port, and also an SD card reader on the 14-inch model. This is something you don't have on the MacBook Air M2. So these are some of the variations to think about. And additionally, I also want to point out as well is that you get two more extra CPU cores that are the performance core. And these are really going to play a role, a lot of it, in the performance for the app that can really go in and utilize the CPU in general, as you're about to find out. As usual on my channel, I will definitely cover other systems as well that are very similar to give us an additional reference machine. So for this, there are two additional Air. One of them is the M2 with 16 gigabyte memory. The other one is the M1 with 16 gigabytes of memory. And also I am put in the Mac Mini with the base M2 SoC on the inside as well. This has been upgraded to 32 gigabytes of memory. And let's see how this performs against the rest of the machine in the lineup. All right. So a few things I want to note about test configuration is that I can't test every single variability of the machine. It's really mathematically and also financially impossible. However, on every single one of my tests, at the very top, you will see that I put down the system resources that those specific tasks and those apps are targeting. And I'll also share that with you verbally as well. So if you pay attention to those, you can really get a pretty good idea as far as how you can configure the machine that is best for the workflow and the tasks that you're running. Another thing that I also want to point out as well is that this is a test that we're really doing a comparison between a consumer leaning versus a pro-oriented chip. You're really going to see a large difference that is going to happen. So that's something to really note. The pro-oriented chip, you can link up more displays to it. There are more high performance core. Sometimes there are also more high efficiency cores on the system as well. You're definitely going to get more GPU than what you get on the consumer leaning one. So there are more capabilities inside the pro chip. And let me simply put it this way. If you are a pro and you're getting this for pro workflow, I would just go with the pro chip to start out with. I wouldn't even look at the more consumer leaning one. All right. With this in mind, my approach will be from a pro photographer standpoint and one who does video as well. And all these testing you're going to see are going to be based on a single app test, because I really want to see how the silicone is performing one against the other and from one generation to the next. I'm not interested in the multitasking as much. And truth be told, if you are a multitasker, if you run multiple programs, get more RAM on the system, and that will take you a long way. All right, this is how you're going to read the specs for the video that I am about to share. I'll leave timestamp to this specific slide too, so you can come back, and if you need to verify how you read the spec, this is how you would do it. Okay, let's talk about SSD. This is the one component that I say you can always expand once your machine has been configured. Now, you have to do this externally via external hard drive, SSD, a NAS or a DAS to link up to the system, but you can always expand the storage on the system. So when it comes to my recommendation for storage, here's the thing. Think about what you're going to use now and what you're going to use tomorrow and configure it based on that. Don't really think too much about the SSD speed. A lot of hype has been going around that, because the benefit you're going to gain from just choosing the right configuration for you capacity-wise is going to be that much better than just really paying more money to get more capacity that you're probably not going to use anyway. Or the other thing too is that you can always fill that up, and you're still going to get a slightly slower SSD once it fills up anyhow. So those are just some of the things to consider. So think about the capacity you're going to use today and what you're going to use in the future, and just go with that. Now, if you really want to know how fast of an SSD you need for a daily workflow in Lightroom and Final Cut, I made a video specifically talking about that, and I'll leave a link to it below in the description. But here's the thing, the TLDR version is that the base SSD like Samsung T5 that can run at 500 megabytes per second is more than plenty, and putting anything faster in there, you're not really going to notice any performance improvement whatsoever. RAM, or memory. This is the component inside the system that you cannot upgrade once you have configured it. So really think carefully about how much you're going to need before you go in and buy the machine, because if you need more RAM, the only way you can really go and upgrade the RAM is to buy an entirely new machine. Think about the model that you work in. Is this a two-machine setup where you have a desktop that can be more powerful, have more RAM, and you have a laptop that takes on the road with you that may not need as much RAM? If this is going to be your singular computer, then I may configure it more RAM. And if you're crazy like me, you have way too many browsers open, more than like hundreds of tabs, multiple programs running in the background, then definitely just get more RAM to start out with. So you're giving the system the resources that it needs to get the tasks that you want to do done quickly. And that would be my recommendation for that. Now, I always tell people that you can always use Activity Monitor, so to monitor how much RAM you're really using in a system to really determine if your current system has enough RAM for what you need or not. The best thing to do is to restart the machine, launch Activity Monitor, go into the memory tab, and look at the memory pressure. You have to peek throughout the day as you're using a program. If you're in the green, you're good. If you're in the yellow or the red, you may want to consider getting more RAM to your system, because that's telling you that there's a lot of pressure going on and you're using a lot. So that's another factor to really consider. If you want a program that will keep track of their memory pressure, your usage on the machine in general for up to 30 days, I highly recommend iStat Menu. I'm not affiliated with them, but I use their program all the time, including to analyze the machine on all these tests as well. And I'll leave a link to their website in the description below. I highly recommend that you check them out. All right, now let's take a look at Lightroom Classic running on the latest Ventura 13.2.1. This is Lightroom Classic 12.2. All the machines support full hardware acceleration. So when we take a look at these machines, yes, getting the Pro is showing us the benefit of 29% speed improvement. And this really comes out to close to around 8 minutes of time improvement, 7 to 8 minutes or so. If this is something you do on a daily basis, this extra $100 to get these time reduction is totally worth it. And I would tell you to get the 14-inch MacBook Pro M2 any single day. Now, what happened when we add in the reference machine? Obviously, the M2 Pro performs just about the same. When it comes to the MacBook Air, they're clustering just close to each other. A few minutes apart, not a big deal at all, but you get the idea for the performance there. What about an export task? For this task, Lightroom Classic is using CPU and GPU heavily. So having more of both of these things on the system accounts for almost a 10-minute time variation, or about a 43% improvement in performance. Remember, this is $100. you're getting this much more. You're getting extra ports, you're getting HDMI, you're getting SD card reader, you're getting a better screen, you're getting active cooling on the system. So this is the reason why I would argue to definitely go for the 14-inch MacBook Pro versus the MacBook Air M2 that just have passive cooling. Here it is, the result when we add in additional machines. What I find interesting is that the Mac Mini M2 Pro is outperforming everything in this chart, and that is because it's in a desktop form factor. There's no thermal limitation. The fan can just spin up as much as it wants, and it can run as fast as it wants. Whereas on the 14-inch MacBook Pro, it is still confined by the 14-inch chassis. So those are things to think about. As far as MacBook Air go, passive cooling, you can start to see the timing on all these machines right there. Let's take a look at HDR Photo Merge. So for this one, between all these machines, they're performing just about the same. The longest time variation between all of them is only about 4 seconds apart, and I wouldn't even think much of this at all. So we're just gonna quickly go through this. Now let's take a look at Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge. This is taking 14 Nikon DA10 file, 36 megapixel to combine and create a 314 megapixel file. This is definitely going to use a lot of RAM, and it will definitely swap on the system. So between these two machines, obviously, because it's using RAM first and CPU secondary, giving this task more memory, it's really going to outperform it. But if you really think about it, time variation is only around 18 seconds longer. It's really not that big of a deal. And if you go through this every now and then, I would still recommend that you get the 14-inch MacBook Pro M2. But if you do this on a constant basis, my recommendation is none of these two machines. In fact, my recommendation would be to get the 14-inch MacBook Pro M2 Pro and upgrade this to 32 gigabytes of memory, and that's really going to take you a much longer way than what you have in the current form right now. So that would be my recommendation. Let's add in other machines in a lineup. Interestingly enough, the 24 gigabyte is performing just about the same as the 32, but you are saving that time. As far as the 16 gigabyte machine goes, timing spreads just very similar to each other. A few seconds longer, not that big of a deal. We're still not talking half a minute or anything like that. It's only a few seconds. So those are some variables to think about. All right, now let's take a look at Lightroom Cloud version. Latest Ventura, this is Lightroom version 6.2. All the machines support full hardware acceleration. And for this, Lightroom Cloud Export is really using CPU, GPU, and RAM all in combination together, and having more of the two variable resources, the CPU and GPU, is definitely showing a benefit. This is showing us a 35% time improvement, close to around a 6-minute time improvement on export. And if this is a program you use, again, 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M2 Pro chip is still the one that I recommend. Now, if you don't mind going to a desktop machine, I would say the Mac Mini M2 Pro, it's really a promising one. But if we're just strictly talking laptops, then still, it will be the 14-inch MacBook Pro M2. And you can see right now, this is how the MacBook Air are really clustering. They're forming a group closer together, probably about like a minute or two apart from each other. Not that big of a deal. They're not really showing data that are drastically different from each other. So this is within range and what we can expect from it. All right, CaptureOne 23 version 16.0.2. Let's take a look at the import time. Less of an improvement, but still an improvement of around 12% or close to around 3 minutes time variation or so. Still, if you use CaptureOne, I highly still recommend that you get a 14-inch MacBook Pro because it can definitely use the extra GPU that this machine have on export. All right, with this in mind, here's all the other machines. You can see that the Air is clustering together. These two machines performing close to about the same. Time variation on imports, kind of whatever. It doesn't really make too much of a difference. Now, here's the thing. I will give you one caveat though, that if you're really using CaptureOne as a tether capture machine, you just want something super light to go on location with that doesn't have a fan or anything like that, there's an argument to be made for the MacBook Air M2 with 24 gigabytes of memory, or even just like 16 for that matter, because if you're just using it as a capture device, it's not really going to be that big of a deal. But if this ends up becoming an all-in-one computer for you, that it's not just using for capture, it's also using for image rendition, for editing and everything else, 14-inch MacBook Pro is still definitely the way to go. All right, let's take a look at CaptureOne Export. Now for this, we're seeing a huge time variation, around 15 minutes or so, and this is around a 38% time improvement. And that is because we have extra GPU in the system. So with this and all the other reference machine, I highly recommend going for the Pro, and this is the reason why I recommend that. So If you're just using it as a capture machine only, that's fine. But if you ever need to render something out quickly for your clients on site, again, you're really talking about a long time rendition between the two that I would just tell you to go with the Pro to start out with. So I hope that you guys that are using CaptureOne find this information helpful. Now let's take a look at Photoshop. For this, I'll be using Digital Lloyd Chamber test, and for these particular tests, I'll be running 3 of his benchmark, the speed, the medium, and the huge. And we'll get to talk about a few extra things too. So let's start out with the speed. There are some time variation between these machines, between 70% and 90% memory allocation, but if you really think about it, just look at this right now. They're literally just only milliseconds apart. That to a human, without a computer timing this, you're not going to notice a variation. So speed between these machines in Photoshop, not really a big deal. However, when it comes to a medium file with 15.7 gigabytes, by the way, this is much larger than a 60 megapixel RAW coming from the camera. Because even if you take those files, those RAW, and export it Photoshop as a TIFF or a PSD, it doesn't even come close to this number. This file has been through a lot, has a lot of layers to it, has a lot of adjustment made to it, and that's the reason why this is a huge file we're dealing with. So if you ever come close to something like this, you now start to see the time variation that is close to around 10 seconds or so. It's still only just 10 seconds. It's not that big of a deal if you have to choose this machine. However, I will tell you this. If you go through tasks that use memories a lot on a daily basis, my recommendation is not to get any of these machines, but to get the 14-inch MacBook Pro, and again, upgrade this to 32 gigabytes of memory because that's going to take you a much longer way. The other thing I also want to point out as well is that this 15.7 gigabyte is almost filling the 16 gigabyte memory on the 14-inch MacBook Pro base already. Now you have to also remember that the operating system and also Photoshop as an app is still using memory at the same time too. So that entire 16 is not just available to Photoshop only, it's being shared with other systems and software that are using it. So those are things to think about. When we add in the rest of the machine, we can see clearly that upgrading memory is showing us the benefit. Although the benefit we're seeing right now between 24 and 32, it's really not that big of a deal at the moment. But nonetheless, there is a benefit. And this is the reason why I was saying that if you work with large files like these on a daily basis and you want a laptop, take the 14-inch MacBook Pro, upgrade it to 32 gigabytes of memory, and just call that the day. And you will see right there that the 16 gigabytes of memory are clustering together because this is the task in Photoshop that uses mostly RAM and secondary CPU, so you're not really seeing the CPU usage come in as much because most of the time is really only using single core. So if this is what you do, I highly recommend going for a machine with more memory to start out with. Now let's look at Photoshop Huge. This is a 56 gigabyte file, larger than majority of us would ever go through. I know there's some out there that goes to this file, but this large file type gives us a really good perspective that even if we have to go through this every now and then and we choose this base 14-inch MacBook Pro with 16 gigabytes of memory, we're looking at about a little bit over 1 minute and 30 seconds longer in time frame. It's not the end of the world. It's not like this task is going to take 5-10 minutes longer. We're only looking at a minor variation of 1.5 minutes. So I would say this is not a big deal at all. Now, let me also preface this by saying if this is something that you work with on a daily basis, again, 32 gigabytes of memory is really going to take you a long way and it's going to cut down the time that this task needs to run quite a bit. But if this is something that you go through every now and then, I probably won't worry too much about just spending an extra 1.5 minutes for it to finish the task. And let me put it this way, this is an extreme edge case that majority of us would not be using something like this anywhere or going through this. Now, on this chart, I did run tests on these machines a few times. I find some of the result interesting, and the one that I find the most interesting is this one, the MacBook Air M2. With 16 gigabytes of memory, 256 gigabyte SSD. The slowest one on this list is performing the fastest. I did run these tests a few times, so this is something I'll probably investigate into the future, but this is the data that I have now. Just some interesting result to think about. Interestingly enough, the MacBook Air M2 24 and the Mac Mini M2 Pro 32 is performing really close to each other. But again, if you have the MacBook Air or you want to get the M2, the max you can go is 24. If you want to get, for instance, the M2 Pro, you don't have a 24 option, so you have to go to 32. So even though there may not be any time variation, you're kind of forced into those specs based on the SoC that you choose anyway. Now let's take a look at Final Cut. And for this, I have combined together H.264, 265, and ProRes 422. You can see that the timing between these machines are very similar. In fact, I didn't test these two Air machines because they're going to perform very close to the Air M2 anyway. So between the M1, M2 generation, there's really not a lot of change in the encoder-decoder engine that makes these tasks significantly faster or anything like that. And if you do video on a constant basis, my recommendation is to either go with the Max or the Ultra because you have more of the encoder-decoder engine that's going to definitely benefit tasks such as H.264 and H.265 export. So those would be the variables that I would consider. All right, let's break all this down and analyze the data. So which one should you choose? When it comes to this, again, as I mentioned, if we go in and upgrade everything, the SoC, the memory, the SSD on this machine, bring it as close as possible to the base 14-inch MacBook Pro M2, we're looking at a price delta of $100. Based on what we're seeing so far, I would definitely choose the 14-inch MacBook Pro M2. Again, better screen, one extra Thunderbolt port on there, you have an HDMI, you have an SD card reader, you have two more high-performance core, and you have an active cooling system. If you use this for a real-world workflow or a pro workflow, all those things that I mentioned will matter and they will make your experience that much better. Yes, it is in a slightly larger chassis, the machine is a little bit heavier, but you're getting much better performance overall from the machine because of it. So those would be the factor that I would definitely consider. Now, if you happen to be using your computer to do tasks that really can utilize the extra memory in the system, what I would tell you to do is still choose the base 14-inch MacBook Pro and upgrade the memory to 32 gigabytes, and that will definitely take you a much longer way. So here's the thing. If you upgrade the 14-inch MacBook Pro, the base configuration, 32 gigabytes of memory, you are increasing the price delta. But if this is something that you do as a pro on a daily basis, it's definitely a worthwhile thing to consider. Not to mention on the M2 Pro, you can link more displays up to the system too. Even though most of us may not use it in that capacity, it is still available. So what I have done is create a chart based on the app that we're using and just a recommendation for the SoC that you may want to choose. It goes from good, better, or best. And if you happen to use multiple apps, then I would just find a common thread between all of them that you use. And if you have any questions about this, you can always drop them in the comment section below too. All right, for Lightroom Classic, definitely at the very minimum a Pro. And if you really can, I would just really think about getting the Max because the Max has extra GPU that Lightroom Classic can utilize in certain tasks, and it will definitely speed up what you do. If you want the top performance, Ultra is definitely the way to go. Now, when it comes to Photoshop, I still recommend the Pro up to 32 gigabytes of memory. If you need 64, you have to go to the Max. And if you need 128, well, you have to choose the Ultra. So you kind of force your way up in the food chain of SoC a little bit, or the pyramid. But if you're okay with 32, the Pro will do just fine. So those are things to think about. Now, the other thing that I will also point out about Photoshop as well is some of you will probably ask, what about the M2? Can the M2 work in Photoshop? I would say yes, you can certainly do that. And if you use M2, what I would do is recommend you upgrade to 24 gigabytes of memory. But by the time you really do that, the price is already teetering on the M2 Pro that you get a much better SoC. You can link up to more displays. You have more performance core in the system, also more GPU, that you're better off just spending that extra few $100s and getting the Pro instead. All right, what about those CaptureOne users? If you use CaptureOne, I recommend getting the Max, but I don't recommend going with the top Max SoC. I would just tell you to get the base Max that has the lowest amount of GPU on the Max because you're gonna get the most performance out of that machine. And if you do video, again, going with the Max or the Ultra is definitely the way to go because you have more encoder-decoder engine. That's definitely going to save you a lot of time. All right, as far as RAM on the system go, if you can get away with 16, that's great. For pros, I still think the sweet spot is 32. If you need more than that, fantastic. But if you just want to configure a really good machine for pro workflow, minimum, I would say go with 32. As far as SSD, choose this based on the size that you need and not so much the speed. 512, it's definitely the minimum, and it's also Apple minimum on many of these machines. But if you can, I would spring for the 1 terabyte because that's also going to give you more room to grow into in the future as well. And if you already have an Apple Silicon, you're looking at an upgrade path, simply put yourself on the Silicon that you currently have. Let's say you have the M1 Pro, and then follow the arrow. An upgrade to the Max would still gain you a lot of benefit, and an upgrade to the Ultra will gain you a lot of benefit. And you don't necessarily have to upgrade to the next generation SoC, especially with the performance we're seeing between all these generations anyway. For example, if you have the M2, one thing to really consider is to leapfrog yourself and upgrade to the M1 Max. You do get a lot of extra performance, extra GPU and everything, and that's something to consider as well. So you don't always necessarily have to linear move in the generation. You can always move one step back or one generation back and go to a higher tier SoC as well. So those are just some variations to consider. Now with this in mind, we're really seeing, right, that every single task that we do, the app doesn't all target the same system resources. Every single task inside those apps target different resources on the system. I've annotated that, I've shared that with you. I hope you find those information helpful and really just thinking about how you can configure the machine that's going to be best suited for your workflow. But if you're really talking about the 14-inch MacBook Pro versus the MacBook Air with an upgraded memory to 24 gigabytes, I would go with a 14-inch MacBook Pro any single day. Anyway, I hope that you find information that I'm sharing with you helpful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new, and we trust.